Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the importance of the 50-week simple moving average. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. The 50-week simple moving average is an important moving average to track because so long as Bitcoin holds it, you could argue the integrity of the market cycle remains intact. And if you zoom in to even the current market cycle, you can see that Bitcoin tested the 50-week SMA in March and April of this year. It also tested it in August and September of 2024. And it didn't quite test it, but it did stay above the 50-week moving average in August and September of 2023. So the 50-week moving average is an important one to track because so far this cycle, it continues to hold as support. And this is one of the ones we looked at earlier this year when we were talking about that if Bitcoin can hold above the 2024 high and hold that 50-week SMA as support on the weekly time frame, then the next rally should be able to take us to new all-time highs, right? Like, it's a possibility. Whereas if we had gone below the 50-week SMA considerably or below the 2024 all-time high, there would have been a higher likelihood that the rally that we're in right now, or the one that we experienced a month or two ago, would not have taken us to all-time highs. Now, let me show you what I mean, all right? So let's go back to 2013. And what you'll notice is that the 50-week SMA really didn't come into play back then until the cycle was over, right? So I actually kind of have a story about this and why last cycle was a lot harder and how I adjusted this cycle with respect to the 50-week SMA. In 2013, once we got to the 50-week SMA at all, the cycle was over. And then you got confirmation basically on the first weekly close below the 50-week moving average, right? When Bitcoin got a weekly close below the 50-week moving average in 2014, it was confirmation that the cycle was in fact over. Again, if you wait for that, you're already essentially halfway through the bear market, right? I mean, back then, had you waited for a weekly close below the 50-week SMA, Bitcoin would have already been down 60% from the high. From there, it did still drop another 60 to 70%, but still, like, half the bear market was already over with. But what can we see from this? With a weekly close below the 50-week moving average, the cycle was over. All right? Now look at the next cycle. In 2021, we also had, kind of this mess over here. But if you just simply look at the post-halving year and going into the midterm year, which is normally when we have our bear markets in crypto, look at this. Look at the following cycle, right? So in 2017, you had a return to the 50-week moving average, and note that the entire cycle, basically, we stayed above it. We weren't even testing it. But once it was tested, that was the beginning of the end, right? And then just a couple months later, we got a weekly close below the 50-week SMA, and in fact, the cycle was over, okay? So you can see it play out twice. You can see it play out in, 2013, 2014. You can also see it play out in 2017, 2018, okay? So a pretty clear indicator to follow. Now, what did we learn from the first two cycles that was actually going to get tested in the next cycle? What we could have said from the first two cycles was that when Bitcoin gets a weekly close below the 50-week moving average, the cycle's over, right? And that when it happens, the bear market is about halfway over as well, right? So again, by the time the close below the 50-week SMA occurs, it's almost an indicator that the bear market is already halfway over. So keep that in mind. The next cycle was tricky. And, I certainly don't get everything right. And I mean, certainly last cycle was no exception. I mean, I got some things right, I got other things wrong. But one of the interesting things back in 2021 is that we actually had a weekly close below the 50-week moving average in July. And yet somehow we still went to a new all-time high. That was very different than what we historically had seen. Okay, it was very different. Because again, if you look at this cycle over here, once we hit the 50-week SMA, cycle was over. That was in 2013, 2014. In 2018, once we hit the 50-week SMA, cycle was over, right? Yeah, you got a dead cat bounce in both cases, but the cycle was in fact over. But then last cycle was different. We hit the 50-week SMA, but we then went to a new all-time high. What's different between 2021 and the two cycles that came before it? Well, the two cycles that came before it, you could argue it was a timing thing. In the first cycle, the first bear market, it occurred in a midterm year when we went to the 50-week SMA. Same thing in 2018. It was a midterm year when we were at the 50-week SMA. But in 2021, that was not a midterm year. That was the post-election year. So you could argue that that's the reason why Bitcoin continued to go up, is if you believe in, the 4-year cycle. Okay. Now, this cycle has been a little different than the last two, in the sense that it keeps testing the 50-week SMA, right? Like it just keeps testing it pretty regularly, right? It doesn't even go that long without testing it. You can see about a year, October 2023, right? It was Q3 2023, Q3 2024, and then Q1, Q2 of 2025. It just keeps on testing it. One of the reasons for this, you could argue, is because we do experience diminishing returns from one cycle to another. And so because of that, we're likely not going to get as far above any specific moving average. And if we're not going to get as far above it, then on pullbacks, we're more likely to hit it. So I think when you look at an indicator like this, and again, I mean, the moving average stuff is a little bit hand wavy. Moving averages are lagging indicators, right? By definition, they are lagging indicators because they're taking an average price that's already happened, right? And so in order to get that average price, you had to have certain price action for that to occur in the first place. So they are lagging indicators by definition. What we're looking at right now is to say, all right, well, so far, Bitcoin has held above the 50-week moving average. And if I were to guess, we'll hit it again, probably sometime in the net. I mean, it could be as soon as Q3. It could also take longer than that, right? I mean, there's no guarantee. If you look at last cycle, we hit it in July, and then we also hit it again in September, right? So, certainly it could play out like that again. Or maybe it does something different, right? Maybe it doesn't hit it again until the midterm year. The point, though, that I want to make is that at some point over the next year, we'll probably see ourselves back at the 50-week SMA. And if it happens in the midterm year specifically, there's a higher likelihood that it would just be a dead cat bounce, right? We're not there yet, right? The midterm year is still a little bit of ways. But it is something to, to keep in mind. I mean, you can see last cycle, it actually occurred in December of the post-halving year. So again, what I would argue in this case is that so long as the 50-week SMA holds, the structure of the market remains intact. A weekly close below that would call things into question, and we haven't had that yet this cycle. And I have to remind myself of last cycle that we did go to new all-time highs after we got one weekly close below the 50-week moving average. And that's one of the reasons why this cycle, like if you followed me last cycle, fortunately, I was actually pretty bullish over here and calling for new all-time highs. But if I had stuck with a lot of the data, I probably shouldn't have, right? I mean, I probably shouldn't have. It ended up working out. But a lot of times this cycle, you've probably heard me say, you need two closes, not just one. You need sort of the first close for something and then confirmation. Like when we go above the bull market support band, you then need another weekly close above it for it to really mean anything, right? Like look at, and really like you want two or three. And you want follow through, because you can see like in July of 2024, Bitcoin got above its bull market support band and then went right back down. And there's been other times where that kind of stuff has happened, where it'll get slightly above it and then it'll just go down. So in this case, we have an indicator that should tell us that the cycle is over whenever we get these weekly closes below the 50-week moving average. It hasn't happened yet. Now, where is the 50-week SMA? Well, right now, it's at around 86K. You know, it's between 85 and 86K. So, the argument in this case is that as long as we're above that, then the structure of the market, the integrity of the cycle is intact. And is there a chance we test it again in Q3? Absolutely. Absolutely. We tested it last Q3. We tested it almost basically the third quarter before that. There's also the other views of sort of acceleration in a Q3, which is not necessarily my base case. But I wouldn't necessarily be that surprised if it happened. The point here that I've tried to make for years is just no one really knows. But one of the things we have known, and we've been very right about, is Bitcoin dominance going up. Right? So by just keeping your crypto portfolio in Satoshis, right, in Bitcoin, it gives you exposure to the upside, and it also helps minimize your downside risk. And so what I would argue is that no one knows exactly when the top's going to occur. And I see all these price predictions all the time from people saying it's going to occur, you know, this month or at this price. And if you look at any other price predictions over the last few years, they keep getting it wrong, right? Because anyone over here was predicting much higher prices. And anytime there's a downturn, it's easy to predict lower prices. But the point is that no one knows exactly when the top will be. But what we have been very aware of is that Bitcoin dominance goes up no matter what. And so in the last couple of cycles, what you'll notice in the first two, right, even after we hit the 50-week estimate, there was at least a dead cat bounce that occurred. So the point is that, and I made this same argument back in early 2025. I said, look, the time to de-risk was during the new administration change. On January 20th, we talked about January 20th likely marking a local top. That was the time to de-risk if you wanted to, in preparation for this drop. We also got a very similar drop in 2017 when Trump took office, right? It just happened a lot quicker, but you'll notice that in early 2017, right here, Bitcoin tested the 2016 high, right? And then it rallied into March, and then got a pullback, and then it rallied into June, and then got a pullback in mid-July, and then it rallied into August with another pullback in September, and then it went into the market cycle top. So when you look at a chart like this, I would argue that the 50-week moving average has shown its significance throughout the cycles, right? It's shown it, and I can't know if we're going to test it in Q3. I think there's a decent chance we'll at least test that bull market support band. But whenever the 50-week SMA fails to hold as support, there's a good chance that you're going into your typical bear market. And remember, the last three bear markets were all in midterm years for the most part, right? 2022, 2018, and 2014. And so, for now, Bitcoin continues to fight. It's not the midterm year, right? It's not the midterm year. Bitcoin continues to fight. And I think the argument is that even if it were to go down here in Q3, there's a decent chance it would bounce right back up a little bit later on, potentially in Q3, just like it did the last couple of years, right? You know, if you look at these last couple of years, right? If you think about last year, we said that Bitcoin would likely break out after a 6 to 9 month downturn. It ended up being about 6, 7, 8 months or so before it broke through. And it broke through in October. And then over here, it also broke through in October. So you have October 2023 breakout, October 2024 breakout. So whether it leads to a breakout or not in October, assuming there's a drop in August, it would still likely be sort of a rally back up, whether it leads to new all-time high or not. And using, you're sort of thinking about it like that, I mean, it's at least allowed me to keep my portfolio Bitcoin heavy, because it gives me exposure to the upside, whatever Bitcoin wants to do. It also minimizes my downside risk. I'm also, aware that 2026, if history is any indication, could very well be a bear market. But we still have some time between now and then, and we'll see what Bitcoin can do. I'm going to be traveling some relatively soon, so I'm not going to be able to provide updates. I would just say keep an eye, or I'll probably have some video updates, but they're going to be pre-recorded. Just keep an eye on this bull market support band, and if there's a drop in sort of the August to September timeframe, that 50-week moving average could become a critical level to in fact watch. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.